said something that made Coach Williams' blood run cold. She said, "My brother does things to me that makes me feel scared. He said it's our secret and I'll get in trouble if I tell. But I don't want him to do it anymore. I want it to stop." Coach William, who had been trained in recognizing signs of abuse, knew exactly what to do. She stayed calm for Sophie's sake, even though her heart was pounding. She told Sophie that she was very brave for speaking up, that what was happening was not her fault, and that there were people who could help keep her safe. She walked Sophie directly to the school counselor's office and stayed with her while the counselor, Mrs. Peterson, took Sophie's initial statement. The counselor followed mandatory report protocols, immediately contacting Child Protective Services and law enforcement. Within hours, a chain of events was set in motion that would change the Michelle family forever. By that evening, Robert and Diana Mitchell received a call from Portland Police Department that no parent ever wanted to receive. Their daughter had disclosed abuse. The perpetrator was their son. They needed to return home immediately. The authorities were already involved, and there was no going back. Think about receiving that phone call for a moment. Think about your entire reality shattering in an instant. Everything you thought you knew about your family, about your children, about your judgment and your choices, suddenly questioned and upended. Diana Mitchell would later tell investigators that her first response was complete denial. This couldn't be happening, not in their family, not with Ethan. There had to be a mistake. Sophie must have misunderstood something, or maybe another child had hurt her and she was confused about who it was. The human mind does this when faced with unbearable truth. It searches desperately for any other explanation, any reality other than the one being presented. But as the detective on the other end of the line calmly explained what Sophie had disclosed, what the counselor had documented, what steps were already being taken, Diana's denial crumbled into horror. Robert, listening on speakerphone, sat in stunned silence. They booked the next available flight home. While her parents raced home from opposite side of the world, Sophie was taken to the Portland Child Advocacy Center, a place specifically designed to be child-friendly and trauma-informed. There, a forensic interviewer trained in talking to children about abuse met with Sophie in a comfortable room with soft furniture and toys. The interview was recorded so Sophie wouldn't have to repeat her story multiple times. The interviewer used age-appropriate language and carefully avoided leading questions. She let Sophie tell her story in her own words, at her own pace. What emerged over the course of that interview was a pattern of abuse that had been escalating over approximately 6 weeks. Sophie described specific incidents with details that no 7-year-old should know. She described her confusion, her fear, how she tried to tell Ethan to stop, how he told her this was normal, how he convinced her she'd be the one who got in trouble if anyone find out. She described feeling like she couldn't breathe sometimes, like her chest hurt, like she wanted to disappear. The forensic interviewer documented everything with professional composure, but inside she was heartbroken. This was her job. She had conducted hundreds of these interviews, but each one hurt. Each child's pain carved another scar on her heart. After the interview, Sophie was examined by a specialized pediatric nurse who documented physical evidence consistent with her disclosure. Sophie was then placed in an emergency protective custody with a licensed foster family. While the investigation continued, she wasn't allowed to go home, not yet, not until it was safe. That night, Sophie slept in a stranger's house, in an unfamiliar bed, probably wondering if she'd done the right thing by telling or if she'd just made everything worse. Children who disclose abuse often feel this way. They feel guilty for breaking up their family, even though the abuse was never their fault. This is the cruel psychology of victimization. The person who did nothing wrong carries the shame and guilt that rightfully belongs to the perpetrator. Meanwhile, Ethan was being interviewed, though under very different circumstances. Detective Sarah Morrison from the Portland Police Department's Child Abuse Unit arrived at the Michelle house with a warrant and two uniformed officers. Miss Chen, who had stopped by for her usual evening checks, was shocked when police arrived. Ethan was read his rights and questioned about Sophie's allegation. His first response was denial. He said Sophie would he said Sophie was making it up. He said she was mad at him because he'd been strict about bedtime and homework while their parents were gone. He said she was trying to get him in trouble, but as Detective Morrison calmly walked through the specific detail Sophie had provided, details that matched physical evidence, details that a 7-year-old couldn't possibly fabricate, Ethan's story began to fall apart. His hands shook, his voice wavered, and eventually, after hours of carefully questioning, he broke down. What Ethan disclosed during that interview painted a picture of a troubled teenager who'd been struggling with thought and compulsion he didn't understand and was too ashamed to seek help for. He talked about his isolation, his loneliness, his exposure to increasingly extreme pornographic content online that warped his understanding of appropriate sexual behavior. He talked about how the fantasy he consumed online began to blur with reality, how he started viewing his sister differently, how the first time he crossed the boundary he told himself it was harmless, just an experiment, just curiosity, but it wasn't harmless. It was never harmless, and each boundary he crossed made it easier to cross the next one. He talked about the shame he felt afterwards, how he'd promised himself he'd never do it again, how he'd tried to be normal around Sophie, but then the urges would come back, and he'd repeat the cycle. He tried to explain it in a way that would make sense, but there was no explanation that could justify what he'd done. Ethan Michelle, at 15 years old, had committed serious crime against his 7-year-old sister. The why didn't change the what. Investigation moved quickly from that point. Police obtained a warrant to search Ethan's electronic device. What they found confirmed everything. His browsing history showed a progression from mainstream pornography to increasingly violent and illegal content involving minors. There were searches about how to keep someone quiet, about what evidence law enforcement look for in abuse cases. There were chat logs where Ethan has discussed his action with anonymous users on dark web forum, seeking validation and advice from other abusers. Digital forensic specialists recovered deleted files, reconstructed timeline, and built a case that would be presented to the district attorney. Ethan was arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual abuse of a minor. Because he was 15, his case would be handled through the juvenile justice system initially, though prosecutors made it clear They were considering trying him as an adult, given the severity and the premeditation of the offenses. When Robert and Diana finally arrived home, exhausted and devastated, their home had been a crime scene. Yellow tape condured of Ethan's room. Evidence collected. Evidence collection unit had photographed and catalogued items. Their son was in juvenile detention. Their daughter was in foster care, and they were left to face the impossible reality that their family as they knew it was gone. Diana's first instinct was to see Sophie, to hold her, to tell her she was sorry, to make it better somehow. But Child Protective Service explained that contact would be limited and supervised until Sophie was ready. Sophie needed time, she needed space, she needed to feel safe before she could face her parents, because in her mind they were supposed to protect her and they weren't there when she needed them the most. The knowledge that their daughter associated them with failure to protect was almost more than Diana could bear. The guilt Robert and Diana felt was crushing. They replayed every decision, every work trip, every video call where Sophie seemed quiet. They hadn't, why hadn't they noticed? Why hadn't they come home when the teacher first called? Why had they trusted Ethan with so much responsibility? Why hadn't they monitor his internet usage? Why hadn't they created an environment where Sophie felt safe telling them immediately when something was wrong? These questions circled endlessly with no satisfying answer. The truth was they had made the same mistake so many parents make. They assumed that bad things happened to other families. They'd trusted that their children were safe in their own home. They'd prioritized their career over their presence, and now they were facing consequences more terrible than they could have imagined. Child Protective Service opened a case investigation, not just into the abuse itself, but into whether Robert and Diana had failed to adequately supervise their children. The question being asked was whether their frequent absence and lack of oversight had created the condition that allowed the abuse to occur. It was a fair question, though hearing it felt like salt in an already gaping wound. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and painful for everyone involved. Ethan's defense attorney argued that he was himself a child struggling with mental health issues and exposure to harmful content that needed treatment, not punishment. The prosecution countered that Ethan had shown deliberately intent, had manipulated and groomed his victim over time. He'd taken steps to hide his action and intimidate Sophie into silence. These weren't impulsive acts by a confused child. They were calculated crime by someone old enough to understand exactly what he was doing and how wrong it was. Forensic psychologists evaluated Ethan and diagnosed him with several conditions, including obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, and what they termed problematic sexual behavior resulting from untreated trauma and internet addiction. Their report noted that Ethan experienced remorse and claimed to understand the harm he'd caused, though they cautioned that true rehabilitation would require years of intense therapy.